Hello and welcome to this discussion about early Christianity in England. And today I'm joined by the Reverend Calvin Robinson. How are you, sir?
Hello, I'm very well. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Good. Obviously, I know you're a man of the church, and we said we'd talk about Christianity, and you wanted to do specifically sort of English or British Christianity,
Yeah.
and sort of perhaps more specifically the early stuff.
Yeah.
So one of the earliest places to start quite often, especially with a fairly low resolution look at things, is St Augustine of Canterbury. But you were telling me that there's actually a tradition, well, obviously when the Romans were here, hundreds of years before Augustine, but you could go back even further.
Yeah, even further than that. So there are rumours that Joseph of Arimathea landed on British soil. This is the chap that buried Jesus, by the way. This is the chap with the tomb. And his first mission to the West, it is told that he came here and evangelized in England for a while. But also there are rumours that St. Paul himself journeyed this far west on his travels. So that we have two great saints from the Gospels who may have set foot on this soil. But let's not forget, of course, the great anthem in that Jesus Christ himself may have come here at some point. So I think we've always been a Christian nation as long as Christianity has been around. Even before St. Augustine, we had a British king, Lucius. And this British king begged Eleutherus, who was the Bishop of Rome at the time, and this is obviously before St. Gregory sent Augustine over here, and he said, please send some Christian teachers to this island. We've also got, of course, the fact that before France was France, it was Gaul, and people were coming over from the continent too, so that was always going on during the 2nd century. So we can trace Christianity all the way back, if not to the 1st century with Joseph and St. Paul, to the 2nd with Gaul, and then with the British King Lucius as well. But then we've got St. Alban. And of course, St. Alban is a martyr, which is why St. Albans in Hertfordshire is named after him. He was a Roman soldier that was beheaded in the 4th century. So we've got from the 1st, 2nd, and 4th. So we've got a long, long history of Christianity in Britain. In the year 314, there were 3 British bishops, and this is recorded at the council in Aries, again in Gaul, in France. 3 British bishops were present. Also at another council a few years later in 359 in Arminum, which is in Umbria. So we've got, although we didn't know where the bishops were from, we knew they were British. So we know that there was an established bishopric or episcopacy in England at that time. And so this is all, of course, before St. Augustine, which is from 597, which is when St. Gregory the Great saw these 3 fair-haired, light-skinned slaves on the continent and said, where are these men from? And someone replied, they are from the Angles. And he said, it cannot be. They are angels, not Angles. A little bit homoerotic. But he then, of course, St. Gregory the Great sent St. Augustine to this nation to evangelize us.
Right, yeah, the famous date is always 597, so Augustine was supposed to have landed here. I must have pushed back ever so slightly on some of those early stories. Yeah. So I think they're, being a history nerd, I don't think that's really firm history, like that Jesus of Nazareth himself visited Glastonbury and things like that,
I mean...
who knows, I wasn't there, but, that sort of thing, there's some of the stories that like Brutus is supposed to have come to England and all that sort of thing. But I think we can certainly say, I'm interested in that period of Christianity before St. Augustine.
Yeah.
So when there were sort of Anglo-Saxon invasions, already the Romans had been and gone to our island. And so Constantine, what's the Edict of Milan, sort of the early 300s. So there were Christians in the 4th century, definitely, 100%
That's
definitely.
important to us because we tend to think that we were Catholic or Roman Catholic before we were Anglican, but we're just Christian. And of course, Rome sent over Augustine to evangelize us. But even before that, we had our own faith. We had an English faith. And we know this because the Irish monks went over to Scotland, to Iona, and set up their monasteries there. And those Celtic monks were spread down into England, into Lindisfarne, which we obviously know because we have lots of records, thanks to Bede, of what went off in Lindisfarne and Northumberland. And King Oswald helped spread the Celtic church. So we had from the north coming down into England. Of course, England was different countries at that point. It was not the standard geography we know today. But we had from the north coming down the Celtic Christians, and from the south from Kent really, which is where Augustine landed, going upwards and west, we had the Roman Catholicism. So we had kind of two fronts at the same time, and I think they eventually amalgamated into one, but even that was controversial. So we had King Oswy of Northumbria spreading the Celtic faith, and we had King Egbert of Kent, the two major princes of the time, spreading religion, and they thought we need to unify in some way, we need to bring this together. And they together, the two princes, selected the first Archbishop of Canterbury. And, well, I say they decided they needed to have one, and they spoke to the Bishop of Rome as a neutral third party. And he selected, actually, to make it even more ecumenical, an Eastern priest. He selected an Orthodox Greek priest to come and be the first Archbishop of Canterbury, and that was Theodore in 668. So we have Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Celtic Christianity all merging in the very, very early centuries, and that has led the way to where we are today. And of course, these people went on to set up the schools and the monasteries, and that's led us to our Christian faith, our Anglican faith.
Isn't it interesting when you see that those really, really, really early, the earliest really kind of the iconography of early Christianity, where it's mixed together with paganism and sort of the Celtic traditions. You've got the Celtic cross, for example. Yeah. And isn't it funny because it's really outside of the remit of Rome, all that sort of thing. Yeah. It's way up in the lost northern islands as far as Rome is concerned. I find it fascinating. You mentioned Iona there, which I also find really interesting. Yeah. There's a great set of quite old documentaries now, Kenneth Clark's Civilization.
Oh, the best, honestly.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
And he talks there about these sort of tiny pockets, even to us way up in the northwest, like places like Iona or tiny little islands like Skellig St Michael, where Christianity held on really by its fingertips, but it was almost completely extinguished. And yet, when there was some sort of revival, for want of a better word, in sort of the 7th century and onwards, that they came alive again. And when we've got the examples of sort of Celtic Christianity, when it comes into conflict with, Rome again, in the 7th century, I suppose you could say, that there's all sorts of tensions there. I don't think it's quite easy from this distance in time to think, it was all, Rome just dominated everything.
No, I think Rome was more of a catalyst in helping to spread Christianity, which was already here. And there were, obviously, like you say, there were the little silos of Christianity that managed to stay strong and survive throughout paganism and different conflicts that we had in the country. But then when the Romans came over, they just infused the faith and strengthened it. And that was very much our invitation. That was very much the English church saying, look, we need some third-party jurisdiction to help support and grow and encourage and basically help us plant churches up and down the country. And so we invited the devil in, so to speak. That's me being a bit naughty there, but essentially that was the back door. And we needed Rome and we wanted Rome. But then, of course, years later, it came to a position where we thought, well, our jurisdiction is being overridden and we need to do something about it, which led us to the first Brexit.
Right.
The Reformation.
The Reformation. Before we get into that, I would like to still pause a bit on Augustine of Canterbury, because obviously he became one of the, not the first, but among the first archbishops of Canterbury, effectively. And so the story goes that the king's wife, Bertha, a Frankish princess queen, she was already a Christian. Yeah. And she'd married the king of Kent, so there's many kingdoms there. He was invited over, and I think basically it seems like Augustine just immediately converted him. So in Ethelbert, was it?
Yeah, it's more like she was in his ear that this is the true faith that you need to join, yeah.
And then it seems that, correct me if I'm wrong on this, or what's your feelings on this, that from various histories I've read, in mainland Europe, in Italy and in what becomes Germany and France, Christianity would quite often begin and be spread amongst the elites and only much more slowly trickle down to the people. Yeah. So where the king of Kent and his wife were relatively easy, I suppose you could say, to convert, it still took centuries before you can say kind of everyone, more or less, is Christian, and a complete repudiation of all sorts of different stripes of paganism. Because Augustine is successful to begin with, but then isn't way out in the sort of the Welsh, more in the Welsh marches, he was sort of rejected. So it wasn't plain sailing by any stretch of the imagination.
No, you're right. And that we were a Christian country in the sense that our elite and our kings were Christian. but doesn't necessarily mean the people were. But I don't think that means the people had another faith. I just think it means there was a disconnect there. And we see that all the way through up to the Reformation, actually. And this is part of the reason for that, in that people used to go to hear Mass rather than to partake in the Mass. And part of that was because it was being said in Latin, because this is what Augustine brought with him, and this is what the Roman Church brought with them. And the priests, many of the priests throughout up and down the country were selected by Rome and imported from other countries. So we didn't very often we didn't usually have Englishmen as clergymen. And so people would turn up to church, the Mass would be going on, but they wouldn't know what it is or what was being said. They'd know it's a holy time, and quite often they'd be there saying their own prayers in private and just getting on with their own business while the priest is doing his thing. And I think that's, again, part of the reason we look towards the Vulgate rather than the vernacular, and look towards one of the first books ever published in England or in the world, actually, with the printing press, was the lay folks Mass book, which was giving people access to not the whole Mass, because at that time it would be sacrilege for someone who wasn't a priest to understand and see the whole of the Mass, because it had never been done. It wasn't a canon law or anything. It's just a tradition that only the priest understood the true Mass. But they put together the lay folks Mass book so you could follow along with the bits that weren't just for the priest, so you could actually know which bits you were supposed to contribute, such as the Lord's Prayer, etc. And even then, most people were illiterate, so it would have been the upper classes that were getting involved to that degree.
Yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? That the normal people would quite often just be told what is in the Bible, and you'd have no way to know if that was right or wrong.
Yeah.
So that obviously, doesn't it, gives quite a big scope for...
It leads to error and superstition and lots of heresy and lots of dangerous tradition.
Well, if you had a priest that was just prepared to just outright lie for his own purposes...
Yeah.
I mean, there's just a huge scope for that sort
of
thing.
Well, like what we have today, priests that see things slightly different to the rest of the church, and they just say that to their congregation, they just believe them.
It's interesting that, again, normal people, completely illiterate, let alone being able to read Latin, would get a lot of their instruction from stained glass windows or from architecture and things. Their visions of heaven or hell might come from actual sculptures and things. It's just a whole different world to what we used to.
A lot of symbolism, a lot of taking things through osmosis. And this is why a good, solid liturgy is important, because you can see that something's important and feel that it's important, feel that something's happening, even if you don't necessarily understand the ins and outs of what the Eucharist is.
I think it's really interesting if you go back to very, very early times. I'm talking here now, like the 8th, 9th, 10th century, that it wasn't just sort of discouraged, but I think at some point it was illegal for normal people, even if you could somehow read a little Latin, it was illegal if you weren't a priest to do so. Yeah. So that's really a complete monopoly by Rome on what is or isn't in the Bible.
And that's not the purpose of the Bible. The gospel is literally the good news, and that's supposed to be spread. Our calling as Christians is to spread the good news. And it's easy to do that if you can read it and understand it. And I think there was, like I say, tradition and superstition at play, in that priests were the only ones who were allowed to understand what was going on in the Mass, but that is inappropriate and wrong. And this is why we as English people were calling for a Reformation, which is entirely different to what was going on in Europe, where the Protestant movement, which is very different to what happened in England, they were arguing for different doctrine. We were saying, look, we need to have access to what's going on in church.
So no wonder, really.
I mean, that's a bit of a generalisation. But
no wonder the first evangelicals or the first Protestants were absolutely outraged to discover what was or was not in the actual text of the Bible. No wonder they felt the weight of centuries of betrayal.
Yeah.
I mean, no wonder. If that was your whole life, your whole spiritual life was wrapped up in this book, and you've been lied to, and all your ancestors for hundreds of years have essentially been hoodwinked. And
this is why... So I wouldn't identify as a Protestant, because I don't think Anglicanism is Protestantism. I think there is a distinction, because what we see on the continent as Protestantism is different to what we have here as Anglicanism. And Anglican literally means, English faith. It's the English expression of the Christian, universal Christian church. But Protestantism was too much of a reaction to Roman Catholicism, in that for them, like, the word is sacrament, the word is all that you need. And for the Roman Catholics, it was the liturgy was all that you need, and people didn't necessarily need access to the word. But I think actually, Anglicanism is via media. It's the middle way. It is, of course, you need the word, and there is no salvation outside of God's word. However, tradition is important too, because the word came from tradition. For many, many years before we had a written Bible, the good news was spread orally. And of course, we are an apostolic faith. We are Episcopal. We have bishops, which are essentially the handing down of the Holy Spirit from the apostle to the bishop, to the next bishop, to the next bishop. That's what apostolic succession is. And we've maintained that regardless of our split from Rome. But those traditions have been handed down, and that's important. And not everything is written down, but everything you need for salvation is written down. However, there are ways of being together as a church that are important and have been passed on through the years.
It's interesting what you say there, and I understand where you're coming from. Would you, just to split hairs ever so slightly for the sake of it, for the sake of conversation, would you not say that the first Anglicans, they wouldn't have called themselves that, but people like Cranmer, or Thomas More, or I don't know, even someone like Erasmus, would they not have thought of themselves as Protestants first and foremost?
No, a lot of them wouldn't. Some of them would, but a lot of them wouldn't, because they weren't Lutherans. A lot of them were Calvinists. A lot of them weren't. There was so much divergence going on, and I think the argument in Europe, especially in Germany, was very, very different to the argument over here. And we adopted a lot of their points, but not on everything. And I think a lot of it for us was actually political.
Well, yeah, it's all wrapped up in the story of really Henry VIII, isn't it?
But even before Henry VIII, William the Conqueror asked the Pope's permission to conquer England, and he got authority from the Pope.
He did, yeah.
That's a very big political move right there. And if we're supposed to be part of one church and united together, that's a great big conflict.
Immediately put Frenchmen in the See of Canterbury, interestingly.
And we were subjected to Rome or rule via Rome, and that was unacceptable for English people.
If we are going to then move on to the Reformation, or I think it's more accurate, don't you think, to say there's Reformations. There's different ones over different times, and the German one is very different to the English one, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And say different thinkers, like say Luther and Thomas More, let's say. Yeah, very different. They weren't of one mind. They didn't agree on everything at all. Or I think it's interesting that someone like, say, Erasmus and Thomas More were very close. There's lots of letters that survive between them.
Yeah.
And they agreed on lots of things, but fundamentally disagreed on others.
Yeah.
But just before we get to that, I did want to ask you briefly, the small amount of correspondence we've had before this interview, I mentioned John Wycliffe and the Lollards, and you said that you thought the emphasis on them is exaggerated in sort of popular history. Yeah. I just would love you to expand on that. What you think?
Because it's always a major focus, and actually, if you look into the history of the Lollards, there were very few of them, and they made very little impact. But historically, people write about them as if they were this great reforming movement and they had a massive sway on where the church is today. But I don't think they do. In fact, I think the Oxford movement had a much bigger impact on the church as it stands today than the Lollards. Right.
Okay. Just to mention for people who might not know, John Wycliffe, not to be confused with Wycliffe Jean, very different people. He's a very, very, very early critic of Catholicism. I mean, what is it? The late 14th century, so the late 1300s. So generations before Luther.
Yeah.
And he did say, even though his movement was very small in terms of numbers and things, just cast shadow over the idea of indulgences and the very structure of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Because some people, I think a lot of people think that Luther sort of came out of nowhere.
No.
But that's not the case, is it? I mean, even by the time he hammers up his problems at Wittenberg, there's already a tradition of people doing things like that, isn't there?
Yeah, well, this is it. Like you said, there was reformations rather than a reformation. I think it's just the Reformation lasted a lot longer than people think it did. Right. And it was a call for the church to fix itself, to sort its act out, to clear the swamp. And the church refused. Of course, there was the Council of Trent, but that happened pretty much after the Reformation. And if they'd have done that before, maybe they wouldn't have been a Reformation to begin with. But it comes from a lot of different angles. You mentioned the Lollards, that's one of them. But I think our jurisdiction and the king having ultimate jurisdiction in this country is another one. So we had, who was the Pope that deposed King John? Innocent III appointed, you mentioned earlier, he appointed Philip of France to claim England. Again, so we had William the Conqueror, we had Philip of France on the Pope's authority to disrupt our country or claim our country. for the Pope, part of the Pope's empire. And I do think it was an empire at that stage, and that's an obvious corruption, because the faith is supposed to be, a religion. It's not supposed to be a political entity. But what happened with our King John is he took a knee to the Pope. He capitulated. And that's a great shame, because the English people did not like that. It was only when Edward III came along and said, actually, no one has the authority to subject the English people without their consent. We've always been democratic in that way, even when we had an absolute monarchy, which is why we've probably evolved into a constitutional monarchy, because we've recognised our sovereignty as important.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.